So hello my friends, Devaun Lennox here, PhotographyPX. In today's video, I want to cover what is a RAW file in depth, how to open one, and some advantages and disadvantages. By the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of what RAW means and have some practical insight to decide if it's best for your workflow. Note, you can find timestamps in the description down below. You can also scrub through the video to skip to a more relevant section if you'd like. But with that said, let's first start by covering what is a RAW file. Well, simply put, without getting too technical in this video, a RAW file is the native file type used on digital cameras. And this file type captures unprocessed image data from the camera's CCD or CMOS sensor. Some believe RAW files are a visual file format, but that's not totally accurate. Instead, a RAW file is a type of raster file that collects information about the analog to digital conversion process that happens in the camera. And what it actually records is the values as the camera converted light to a voltage at the time of exposure. The basic idea of that conversion is that light enters through the lens, strikes the sensor and each of its pixels. The camera then converts the intensity of the light and its color, either red, green, or blue, into a specific electrical charge. And it records all of this information across its 24 million pixels, or whatever your camera's resolution is. It then combines all of these values into a single file, encoded as binary data, which is just ones and zeros, and it shoots that file out to the memory card without adding compression or changing it in any way. So in reality, a RAW file simply stores data, not a photo. And because of this, we can't see this file natively with our naked eyes, and it always requires software to interpolate or demosaic the data so we can convert it into a tangible visual format that we can see with our computers or our devices, such as JPEG, TIFF, or PNG. But if you are curious why you can see a RAW file on your camera's viewfinder or on the rear LCD, even though it's technically not viewable, here's why. Camera manufacturers include a full-size JPEG preview thumbnail that each RAW file makes to make things easier in the field. So every time you take a photo, your camera actually takes essential information from the RAW image and immediately converts it into a JPEG so you can review the images as they're shot in real time. Overall though, the basic idea of shooting RAW is to maintain the best image quality possible on your camera and also the most freedom to edit the final image. And since RAW files are uncompressed data directly from your sensor, these files deliver on both fronts. They're entirely free of any sharpening, saturation, or even contrast, yet they also deliver the most detail out of all raster file types, which is why they're currently a standard amongst most digital cameras, image scanners, and even film scanners. So next, what are the differences between RAW and JPEG? I'm going to quickly go through the main differences, but I will record another video separately discussing these differences in great depths. The main differences are though, with RAW, you receive the original unprocessed image data that is captured at the time of exposure. Doing so allows you to capture photos with the most accurate color, best image quality, and most post-processing freedom. JPEG, on the other hand, applies any in-camera adjustments you made along with lossy compression. It also throws away irrelevant image data, which mostly revolves around color information. So it's not ideal if you value color accuracy or you want to be printing your photos, especially at larger sizes. These changes it makes are also baked into the file permanently, which also makes your photography workflow destructive right from the get-go. And while the smaller file size of JPEG is convenient, especially when sharing photos online or wanting to increase your camera's burst performance, it doesn't produce the best possible results. With that said, what's the best way to open a RAW file? When it comes to these formats, it's important that I point out that each RAW file is a proprietary file format to both the camera manufacturer and often even the specific camera model. And there's currently no universal RAW file format besides Adobe's DNG file to some extent. Sadly, that means each file only works with compatible editing software. I'll list the most popular RAW editors right now: Adobe's Photoshop, Adobe's Lightroom, Affinity Photo, Capture One, DxO Photo Lab, Darktable, Exposure X6, GIMP, Luminar AI, ON1's Photo Raw, and Raw Therapy. Without the right software, your computer has no way of demosaicing the data from a RAW file. Demosaicing, if you're unfamiliar with this particular term, is the process of reverse engineering the raw image data from a single color into a full RGB image. It's a very specialized process, and if the software doesn't know how to interpret the sensor data from the camera, it'll have no way of reading the file. Thus, you can't view or edit the photo. As you'd imagine, this causes enormous problems, and it's quite a pain for software developers since updating their algorithms takes time. Unfortunately, it ends up taking several months or even a year at times to see third-party apps support a new camera. During that time, your best bet is actually to use a first-party RAW viewer or editor instead from your camera's manufacturer. Otherwise, you'll want to shoot JPEG and RAW. Okay, so I've just stressed that opening a RAW file is somewhat inconvenient, but what are the advantages that this file format offers to us as photographers? Firstly, shooting in RAW doesn't bake in your camera's color settings or white balance. Instead, the file captures all the original color information and leaves it untouched. So you can change the white balance afterwards by changing how your software editor interprets those colors. Next, RAW doesn't bake in the color space, usually sRGB or Adobe RGB, into the file, so you can also change these later if needed. You also capture the entire color range or gamut your camera produces, creating colors that are far more precise and nuanced than JPEG. Most cameras capture either 12 or 14-bit color, which provides several times more information than a standard JPEG file, which is only 8-bit by contrast. The result is that you get superior color accuracy and smoother gradations. You also rarely see any color banding, posterization, or blockiness in your photos, which are all great. And now you have more room to fine-tune the colors in post-processing. Next, shooting in RAW lets you capture your camera's actual dynamic range, which is the exposure latitude between the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights of an image. And it's rare that RAW files don't include some information in both overexposed highlights and the clip blacks. So even if these areas appear lost at first, you can usually recover details there without seeing pixelization or noise. Speaking of noise, since the RAW file is uncompressed, it doesn't apply any in-camera noise reduction or sharpening, and that lets you apply more complex sharpening techniques or noise reduction tools later in post-processing. Next, RAW files are uncompressed files by default, unless you specifically shoot lossless compressed RAW in your camera, but either way, you still bypass any image compression artifacts that reduce sharpness, contrast, and cause pixelation. And these compression artifacts plague the JPEG format. Lastly, shooting RAW is genuinely non-destructive since all of the changes you make in post-processing act as adjustment layers. With RAW, you always edit a reference file, not the original file or data itself. So adjusting something like contrast in Lightroom doesn't change the contrast in the file itself. Instead, it modifies a sidecar XMP file, which is a set of instructions to adjust the on-screen interpretation of the data and how your software shows you the photo. These then become a set of instructions that are applied only when you export the photo to another visual file format like JPEG, TIFF, or PNG. Then and only then are the changes permanent, but the RAW file itself is always left untouched. Now, while all of these advantages sound fantastic, RAW isn't without its trade-offs, and it does have some noticeable disadvantages. The first one is the fact that this file format always requires post-processing. Unfortunately, RAW files being proprietary image data means that most third-party applications do not support them, so you can't view them with average programs or even share them online. Sadly, that means you always have to tackle the post-processing workflow to some extent, and there's no escaping that. Even something simple like converting a RAW photo to a JPEG will usually require a computer and some effort, and it surely requires specialized software. This fact alone is why many photographers feel that shooting in RAW is a deal breaker, because it's somewhat tedious and time consuming to do this, especially when you're traveling. Another downside is the file size and storage requirements of RAW. When you capture uncompressed RAW data from your camera, it creates a substantially larger file than you probably expect. We're talking your average RAW file taking around 20 to 30 megabytes, while a JPEG is 5 to 10 megabytes, so they're roughly 4 times larger. And unfortunately, a larger file size means each photo takes up more space on your SD card, computer, and your hard drive. It also means your camera quickly fills its buffer during continuous shooting, causing the frame rate to drop, and that could be the difference between shooting at 10 frames per second or dropping to 5 frames per second. So this format isn't ideal if your SD card is tight on space or your hard drive's almost full. Lastly, file sharing and compatibility. There isn't a standardized RAW file like I mentioned earlier, so that inevitably means that not all editors can open each file. So a Canon branded software like EOS Utility cannot read a Sony branded RAW file. And this lacking compatibility is one of the keys that makes shooting a RAW the most challenging to work with, as it always requires some unique software. And sadly, most of these softwares are subscription based. You also can't upload or view these files on a standard website or even social media since they're too large and they have specific viewing requirements, and that just adds to the complications. But in conclusion, RAW files are an essential part of photography today, and they're here to stay. So despite their inconvenience, they do provide photographers with the most creative freedom and the best image quality. So long term, if you want to master photography, we do recommend shooting RAW if you want the best your camera offers. Thankfully, almost all modern digital cameras, be they beginner or professional level, let you shoot RAW, so you can access the benefits of RAW at any time. That said, there are a few situations where shooting RAW isn't ideal, so it's not the holy grail for every photographer. And those main situations are as follows. You want a quick turnaround time or a simple photography editing workflow. You have limited storage space. You shoot either sports, wildlife, or photojournalism, and you need the fastest buffer your camera offers. You're shooting a casual birthday party, a selfie, Thanksgiving, holiday, and you don't want to post-process one of these images. And lastly, if you're a beginner looking to see if photography is a long-term passion. In these situations, shooting RAW will slow your workflow and will become a hassle in a meaningful way. So these are all instances to shoot JPEG. But there you have it, my friends. There's our perspective on RAW files. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found the content of it valuable, insightful, and you learned something meaningful here. If you're new to our channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. If you have any comments, questions, or feel like I've overlooked something in the course of the video, please let me know down below. I've been your host, Devaun Lennox, Photography P. .com.